It was an ordinary evening, the sun setting slowly behind the tall buildings of downtown Atlanta. The streets were busy, with people bustling about, finishing their daily routines. The city hummed with the noise of traffic and life. But for Keira James, it was just another day of working late at her law office, preparing for an upcoming trial. Keira was used to long hours. She had worked hard to get to where she was, an accomplished state lawyer with a reputation for being sharp, strategic, and relentless. But what she didn't expect as she left the office that evening was to be confronted by a figure of authority who would challenge everything she had worked for. As she walked toward her car, she noticed the flashing lights of a police cruiser ahead. She thought nothing of it, just another routine traffic stop, probably nothing to concern her. But as she reached her car, the officer stepped out from behind the cruiser and called out to her. "Hey, you! Stop right there!" the officer barked, his tone laced with an aggression that immediately raised Keira's eyebrows. She stopped, perplexed. The officer was young, with a stern look on his face, his hand resting on his holster. He had the air of someone who had a point to prove. "Yes, officer?" Keira asked, keeping her voice calm, her instincts alert. "You're trespassing," the officer said, a slight sneer on his lips. "I need to see your ID." Keira blinked, surprised. "Trespassing? I'm on public property, officer. I'm leaving my office building." "I said, show me your ID," the officer repeated, stepping toward her with an air of authority that bordered on hostility. Keira's calm demeanor remained unshaken, but her thoughts were racing. She had worked with law enforcement officers plenty of times in her career. Never had she encountered such outright rudeness or a lack of professionalism. Still, she reached into her purse and produced her state-issued ID. "Here's my ID, officer. I'm an attorney," she said, handing it over, her eyes narrowing as she gauged his reaction. But instead of looking at her ID, the officer snatched it from her hand, his face tightening in disdain. "An attorney, huh?" he muttered, barely glancing at it. "Doesn't matter. I'm placing you under arrest for obstruction." Keira froze for a moment. The words hung in the air. "Arrested? Obstruction?" she asked, incredulous. "For what? I haven't done anything wrong." The officer didn't respond. Instead, he pulled out his cuffs, moving quickly as he seized her wrist. Keira could feel her pulse quicken, but she held herself still, knowing that protesting would only escalate the situation. "Why are you arresting me, officer?" she demanded, her voice steady but firm. "I haven't committed any crime." The officer just shrugged, cuffing her hands behind her back. "You'll figure it out soon enough." As the officer pushed her toward the cruiser, Keira's mind raced. She had always known that racial profiling was a reality for many people, but she never thought it would happen to her. She had worked hard to prove herself in a world that often overlooked women like her, black women, ambitious, outspoken, and relentless. And now, she was being arrested for nothing. The officer placed her in the back seat of the cruiser without a word, and as the vehicle began to roll toward the precinct, Keira sat back, her thoughts focused on one thing: justice. Keira knew that she wasn't just any woman off the street. She was an attorney, a state lawyer no less, and this officer, whoever he was, had just made a grave mistake. This wasn't the end of the story. In fact, it was only the beginning. As the police cruiser rolled into the precinct, Keira sat in the back seat, her mind sharp and calculating. She had been arrested before, never in a situation like this, of course, but she knew the drill. When they finally stopped, the officer opened the door and pulled her out without speaking a word. Keira was led down a cold hallway, the sound of her heels clicking on the tile floor echoing through the empty corridor. She was aware of the stares from officers who passed by, and it bothered her more than she cared to admit. The tension in the air was thick with the assumption that she was just another person who didn't belong here, who had been caught in some petty crime. The officer, still silent, shoved her into a small holding room. As he slammed the door shut, the sound of the lock clicking behind her made her stomach drop. She could feel the familiar weight of her phone in her pocket, but she knew better than to make any sudden moves. There would be time for her to call for help, when it was the right moment. Keira stood by the table in the center of the room, her thoughts racing. She couldn't believe this was happening. She had spent years working with law enforcement, studying the law, prosecuting criminals, fighting for justice. She had worked harder than most to get to this point, to earn the title of state lawyer, and now, here she was, accused of obstruction by a racist cop who had no idea who he was dealing with. Minutes passed like hours, and she finally heard footsteps approaching. The door swung open, and a man stepped inside. Keira immediately recognized the man, the police captain. He was tall, his uniform well-pressed, and there was an air of authority about him that immediately put her on edge. She had seen him before, though not personally. He was a fixture in the local news for his tough-on-crime stance. "Miss James," the captain said, his voice smooth but with a cold edge to it. "I'm Captain Jenkins. I'm sure you're wondering why you're here." Keira remained calm, her face a mask of professionalism. "I've been wondering that since the moment your officer decided to arrest me for no reason." Captain Jenkins's eyes narrowed. "You were causing a disturbance. The officer had reason to believe you were obstructing justice." Keira let out a small laugh, a hint of disbelief in her voice. "Obstructing justice? Officer Wilson didn't even bother to ask for my identification before he put me in cuffs. That's not obstruction, that's abuse of power." The captain didn't respond immediately. Instead, he studied her, his eyes narrowing as if trying to gauge her reaction. "You're an attorney, correct?" he asked, his tone shifting ever so slightly. "I am," she replied, her gaze never leaving his. "And I will be filing a complaint against your officer for wrongful arrest and racial profiling. I also expect an immediate release, or I will have my office involved in the matter." Captain Jenkins took a moment to process her words. "You'll be released after processing," he said. "But I'll need to remind you that cooperation with the law is expected, regardless of who you are." Keira's expression didn't change, but she could feel her pulse quicken. She had never been one to back down from a fight, especially when the stakes were this high. This wasn't just about a wrongful arrest, it was about setting a precedent. She was determined to make sure that Officer Wilson's actions didn't go unchallenged. As the captain left the room, Keira was left alone with her thoughts. She had a case to make, and she would make it. The woman who had been humiliated, the attorney who had been wrongfully arrested, she was going to make sure that the truth came out. But first, she had to get out of this holding room. And she would. She wasn't going to let one officer's mistake define her. Keira James was going to take control of this situation, just like she had done so many times before. The hours that followed were a blur for Keira. She was processed, fingerprinted, and held in the small holding room until finally, after what felt like an eternity, the door opened again. This time, it was Officer Wilson, the officer who had arrested her. His expression had changed, no longer carrying the same smug arrogance it had when he first placed her in cuffs. "Miss James," he said, his voice now cautious, "you're free to go." Keira didn't respond at first. She simply stood up, collected her things, and walked out of the holding area without a word. The officer didn't try to stop her, but she could feel his eyes on her, filled with the weight of his earlier mistake. As she made her way to the exit, Keira pulled out her phone and immediately dialed her law office. By the time she reached her car, her assistant had already arranged for a meeting with her legal team. Keira wasn't going to let this slide. There would be consequences, not just for Officer Wilson, but for the department as a whole. She knew that filing a complaint wouldn't be enough. She wanted real accountability. The next day, Keira filed a formal complaint against Officer Wilson for racial profiling, wrongful arrest, and violation of her civil rights. The story quickly gained traction in the media, with local news outlets covering her wrongful arrest. What had started as a humiliating experience turned into a moment of public reckoning, and Keira wasn't backing down. She demanded that the police department take responsibility for its actions. Weeks later, Keira sat in a courtroom, not as a defendant, but as a representative of justice. Officer Wilson stood before the judge, his face pale as Keira presented the evidence. The case was clear. His actions had been fueled by racial bias, and he was now being held accountable. Keira smiled. This wasn't just about one officer. It was about making sure no one else had to endure what she did.